On a distant planet, far from Earth, the laws of emotion ruled the lives of every citizen. Here, feelings were not just controlled, they were forbidden. The alien race that lived on this planet, known as the Karens, were born with emotions just like any other species. But their society had long ago decided that emotions were dangerous. They clouded judgment and led to chaos. So, a law was passed that no one could express emotion. Those who did were punished severely. The Karens were forced to live in cold silence, a world where even the smallest hint of feeling was a crime. In the heart of this emotionless world was a young Karen girl named Alira. She was different from the others. While most Karens had learned to suppress their emotions from birth, Alira still felt the stirrings of something deep inside her. She could feel it in her chest, a tightness, a yearning, but she kept it hidden. It was dangerous to show emotion, and Alira knew that more than anyone. She had watched her parents, once warm and loving, turn into cold, distant figures after the law was enforced. Her mother never smiled anymore, and her father had grown silent, as though life had drained out of him. Alira had learned early that this was the price of survival in her world. But that didn't stop her from feeling. At night, when the city was quiet and the stars hung like cold, distant lights above her, Alira would let herself imagine. She imagined a world where she could feel freely, where she could laugh, cry, or even love without fear. It was a forbidden thought, but it brought her a sense of freedom, even if it was only in her mind. The law of her people was clear. Emotions were to be suppressed, hidden away, and never allowed to surface. And yet, every day, Alira found herself fighting the urge to break free from the suffocating silence that surrounded her. Alira's life was a routine of empty spaces. She would go to school, where the teachers taught logic, facts, and knowledge, but never feelings. She would study, listen, and nod along, all the while feeling like an outsider in her own body. Her classmates seemed so empty. They spoke in monotones, laughed with no joy, and moved through life like automatons. No one questioned the laws. No one ever dared to. One day, as Alira was walking home from school, she noticed something different. A small crowd had gathered around a large, metal vehicle in the center of the city. It was unusual for the authorities to be out in the open like this. Curious, Alira edged closer, her heart beating faster as she approached. What was happening? She stood on her tiptoes to peer over the crowd. Her eyes widened when she saw a human figure standing next to the large metal vehicle. The human looked nothing like the Karens. He was tall, his skin a strange color, and his clothes were unlike anything Alira had ever seen. The human was speaking to the authorities, his voice calm but commanding. Alira couldn't hear the words, but something about the way he held himself made her feel something strange. A rush of warmth spread through her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. It was like a spark of life had been lit inside her, a feeling that shouldn't exist in a world like hers. For a moment, Alira was frozen in place. She knew she should look away, but she couldn't. Her heart raced in her chest as she watched the human. His presence was magnetic, and she felt herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. She quickly looked around, making sure no one had seen her. If anyone noticed her emotions, even for a moment, it could mean her end. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger, like a forbidden force she couldn't control. Alira took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the warmth lingered inside her. It was the first time in her life that she truly felt something. In that moment, Alira realized something. The laws of her people might have controlled her actions, but they couldn't control what she felt. And in the deepest part of her mind, Alira knew that she had to know more about this human. She had to understand why he had made her feel this way. The quiet, cold world she had known was no longer enough. As she turned to leave, her heart still pounding in her chest, Alira couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. She had always known there was more to life than the cold silence she lived in, but now, for the first time, she believed it. The human was the key, and Alira was about to find out just how much he would change everything. Alira couldn't stop thinking about the human. The moment she had seen him, something inside her had awakened something long dormant, something forbidden. It had been an undeniable pull, a magnet drawing her in, but she couldn't explain why. His presence was unlike anything she had ever encountered in her lifeless world. There was a warmth in him, an energy that seemed to flow freely, unburdened by the constraints her society imposed on her. The more she thought about him, the more she realized how empty her world had become. It was as if the human had reminded her of a truth she had long forgotten, that life was more than just surviving. It was about feeling, about living. Days passed, and Alira found it harder to focus on the routine of her life. She could barely concentrate in school, her mind drifting back to the human. His face, his manner, and that sense of freedom in his movements all stayed with her. She tried to push it aside, to ignore the stirring inside her, but it was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him standing there, speaking with the authorities, his words firm, his presence commanding, and the strange warmth inside her grew, feeding her curiosity. That evening, as Alira walked through the quiet streets of her city, she found herself in the same area where she had first seen the human. She told herself it was a coincidence, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She needed to see him again. Her steps quickened, her heart pounding, as she neared the spot where he had stood. She looked around, hoping no one would notice her. In a world where emotions were a crime, the last thing she needed was to draw attention to herself. Her eyes scanned the area, and just as she was about to give up, she spotted him standing near a tall, metallic structure. The human was talking to a Karen official, but his attention seemed to wander, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest of moments. It was as if time slowed. Alira's breath caught in her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was frozen in place, caught in the intensity of that gaze. The world around her seemed to disappear, leaving only the human and the pulse of her heart. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the air thick with something unspoken. Then, almost as if sensing her inner turmoil, the human turned and walked toward her. Alira's mind raced. What was he doing? Should she run? Was she about to be discovered? The laws of her world flashed before her eyes, laws that would surely punish her for even the smallest sign of emotion. But despite the fear, a strange urge pulled her toward him when he reached her. His voice was calm but steady. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone carrying an unfamiliar warmth. Alira blinked, unsure of how to respond. How could she explain that she wasn't all right? That she had never felt so alive, so full of emotions she wasn't allowed to have? Instead, she simply nodded, her throat tight. The human seemed to sense her hesitation. He studied her for a moment, his eyes softening. "I know this world must seem different," he said, his words hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. "But you don't have to hide who you are." Alira's heart beat faster. His words felt like a whisper of freedom, like a light in the darkness of her world. For the first time in her life, Alira wondered if she could take that step, if she could let herself feel again, without fear of the consequences. But the risks were too high, the laws were too strong, and the punishment for defying them was severe. She had been taught from a young age that emotion was a dangerous thing, something to be feared, something to be hidden. But the human's presence, his gentle understanding, made her question everything she had been taught. Was it really so wrong to feel? Was it really so dangerous to let herself experience what she had locked away for so long? I don't know what you mean," Alira said quietly, her voice trembling. But deep down, she knew. She knew exactly what he meant. The human smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "I think you do," he said softly. "And I think you're stronger than you realize." With those words, Alira felt something shift within her. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Something had been unlocked, something that could never be put back. The walls around her heart, built by a lifetime of fear, began to crumble. And in that moment, Alira understood. Her life had changed, and for the first time, she was ready to feel. Alira couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was changing. Every day since meeting the human, her world felt different. The cold silence that had once been a constant presence in her life now seemed suffocating, unnatural. She had always believed that emotions were a curse, that they were dangerous. But now, with every passing moment, she felt a growing desire to break free from the chains that bound her. The human, with his warmth and presence, had awakened something within her, something she wasn't sure she could control. She found herself seeking him out again. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something she could no longer deny. Every glance she caught of him, every word they exchanged, made her heart race. Illyra knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop herself. The emotions inside her were too strong to ignore, and the more she was around him, the more she realized that the world she had grown up in, the world of suppression and silence, wasn't the only way to live. One evening, after a particularly long day at school, Illyra found herself walking down the same quiet street where she had first met the human. She told herself it was just a coincidence, but deep inside, she knew better. She was searching for him. As she turned a corner, she saw him again standing by the same metallic structure, looking out at the city with a sense of calm that made her heart skip a beat. He seemed so different from everyone around her. There was an ease in his posture, an openness that Illyra envied. Before she could think twice, she was walking toward him. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the empty street, but her mind was too focused on him to pay attention. When she reached him, she hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. But the human, as always, seemed to know exactly what to do. He turned to her with a gentle smile, his eyes warm but full of curiosity. "You keep coming back," he said, his voice soft, almost teasing. Illyra's heart fluttered at his words, but she quickly composed herself. I wanted to see you again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The human nodded as if he had expected this. "I've noticed," he said. "Is there something you're trying to find?" Illyra paused, her mind racing. The question felt loaded, like he could see straight through her. She had always lived her life in quiet solitude, never allowing anyone to get too close. But now, with him, it felt different. She could feel the walls she had built around herself beginning to crack, and she was terrified. What if she couldn't hold it together? What if her emotions got the better of her? "I don't know," Illyra finally said. "I just feel something when I'm around you. Something I've never felt before." His expression softened, and he took a step closer to her. "It's okay to feel," he said gently. "You don't have to hide it." The words hit Illyra like a wave, crashing over her with such force that she almost couldn't breathe. For so long, she had lived in a world where emotions were a crime, where feeling was something to be ashamed of. But here, in this moment, with this human, it felt like a weight was lifting from her chest. The fear that had consumed her for so long began to fade, replaced by something new, something she couldn't quite name, but desperately wanted to explore. Illyra's hands trembled as she reached up to touch the cold surface of the metallic structure. Next to her, grounding herself, she had spent her whole life believing that emotions were a curse. But now she wondered if they were the key to something greater. Could she really live freely, without fear of what her feelings might bring? The human's eyes never left hers, and for the first time, Illyra allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the walls she had built around herself. The world she had always known, the cold silence, the rigid rules, was no longer enough. There was something more, something beyond the fear, and for the first time in her life, Illyra wanted to know what it felt like to truly live. Her heart raced as she looked at him, the question hanging between them. Would she take the leap? Would she allow herself to feel, to break free from everything she had been taught? For the first time, Illyra didn't care about the consequences. She was ready to find out. The decision to step beyond her limits was not easy, and Illyra knew that the moment she allowed herself to feel, there would be no turning back. It wasn't just about the human, it was about everything she had suppressed for so long. Her entire life had been defined by rules that stripped her of her identity, and now, in the presence of someone who made her question everything, she realized how much she had lost. The weight of those years without emotion felt heavier than ever before. She had lived a life without truly living, and now, the door to something more had been opened. That evening, as Illyra stood beside the human once again, she felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. His presence was like a beacon, drawing her out of her shell, but it was the warmth in his eyes that made her feel alive. She had learned to bury her emotions deep inside, but every time she was near him, they clawed at the surface, demanding release. The quiet, controlled life she had always known was slipping away, and for the first time. She wasn't afraid. "You're different from everyone here," Illyra whispered, her voice trembling as she spoke. The words felt foreign on her tongue. She had never been allowed to say them before, and now, in the safety of his company, they flowed easily. "Why don't you feel afraid? You're a stranger in this world, and yet you stand here so freely." The human's gaze softened, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe it's because I don't have to follow the rules," he said, his voice low, yet filled with conviction. "Maybe it's because I've seen what it's like to truly live, and I can't pretend anymore that being locked inside a cage is the answer." Illyra felt a pang in her chest, the words striking deep. It was as though he had seen straight through her carefully constructed walls, and to the very core of her being. How many times had she wished to break free? How many times had she longed to show the world who she truly was, without fear of the consequences? Her eyes flicked to the ground, her thoughts a swirling mess of doubt and desire. "But I've been taught that emotions make us weak," Illyra murmured, her voice almost drowned out by the rush of thoughts in her mind. "If we let ourselves feel, we lose control. We become dangerous." The human stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, until Illyra could feel the warmth radiating off him. "That's what they want you to believe. They want you to think you're not strong enough to handle your emotions. But the truth is, your emotions are a part of you. They make you who you are. It's not weakness to feel, Illyra. It's what makes you strong. You have to believe that." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with a force she couldn't escape. Illyra had always been told that emotions were a danger, that they were a threat to her society's perfect order. But now, standing in front of this human, those beliefs seemed so hollow. The laws of her people were built on fear, on the assumption that if emotions were allowed to flourish, chaos would follow. But what if the truth was that without those emotions, they were merely existing, not truly living? Illyra's hands shook as she fought to contain the storm of feelings threatening to break free. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could hear her own breath as it quickened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let go, to feel the warmth of what it meant to truly live. Slowly, cautiously, Illyra lifted her gaze to meet his, her breath caught in her throat. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the depth of his conviction, and in that moment, she made a choice. She was no longer willing to live in fear. She was ready to break free from the chains that had held her captive for so long. For the first time in her life, Illyra let herself feel. The weight in her chest lifted as a warmth spread through her. It was the feeling of freedom, the realization that she could be more than just a prisoner of the rules that had governed her existence. As she reached out to touch the human's hand, she felt the connection between them, raw and undeniable. "I want to feel," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, but also with hope. "I want to be free." The human smiled softly, his grip on her hand tightening. "Then let yourself. Let everything out. You don't have to be afraid anymore." In that moment, Illyra understood. The walls were gone, and for the first time, she was truly alive. The revolution had begun, but Illyra couldn't shake the feeling that it was all happening too quickly. The floodgates had opened, and emotions, the very thing that her people had been taught to suppress, were now at the heart of everything. She could feel it in the air, in the faces of those around her. People were beginning to talk, beginning to question the laws that had kept them trapped in silence for so long. It was as if the world was waking up, and Illyra wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But there was no going back. The human had shown her a glimpse of something she could never forget. His belief that emotions weren't a weakness, but a source of strength, resonated with her in a way she couldn't explain. It was something she had never allowed herself to think before, something she had been taught to fear. Yet now, as she stood at the edge of this uncertain future, she realized that she wanted more. She wanted to feel everything. Love, joy, sadness, anger, all of it. She wanted to experience life in all its chaotic beauty, and she wanted to help others do the same. It was in the quiet moments when the weight of the rebellion settled in that Illyra found herself torn. The authorities, those who upheld the emotion-suppressing laws, had already begun to push back. The resistance was growing stronger, but so were the consequences. Illyra had seen firsthand how cruel the Karen government could be when someone broke the rules. Her heart ached as she thought of the families who had already suffered, the friends who had been punished for simply feeling. The rebellion was about freedom, but it was also about sacrifice. She knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The risk of losing everything, even her life, loomed over her. The human, who had shown her the truth about herself, was still by her side, unwavering in his commitment to the cause. Together, they had led countless meetings, rallying those who were ready to fight. But Alira couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep this up. The Karen government wasn't going to back down easily. And the more they pushed, the more the rebellion grew, the more the fear spread. One evening, as the sun set over the cold landscape of her world, Alira found herself alone with the human in the midst of their growing movement. She had learned more about him in the short time they'd spent together than she ever thought possible. He was passionate, relentless in his pursuit of freedom, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Alira hadn't noticed before. It was as if he, too, carried the weight of the revolution, the burden of knowing what was at stake, and the consequences of failure. "Are you afraid?" Alira asked, breaking the silence between them. The question had been on her mind for days, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to ask it. Now, in the stillness of the evening, it seemed like the right time. The human looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yes," he said simply, "but fear isn't the problem. It's how we choose to act in spite of it." Alira's heart ached at his words. She understood exactly what he meant. Fear had been the force that had kept her in line her entire life, the reason she had buried her emotions so deep. But now, standing with him, she felt a new kind of courage bubbling up inside her, a courage she never thought she had. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of her mind, but it no longer had the power to control her. The rebellion wasn't just about changing the laws, it was about changing everything. It was about giving people like Alira the freedom to live, to feel, to experience the world without fear. And as much as Alira feared the consequences, she knew that this was the only way forward. The fight for freedom was never easy, but it was worth it. With the human by her side, Alira felt a sense of determination that she had never known before. The future was uncertain, and the risks were high. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let fear dictate her life anymore. She was ready to stand up for herself and for everyone who had been silenced by the law. And for the first time, Alira allowed herself to believe that they could win. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly as the tension in the city grew. Alira could feel it in the air, the mounting pressure, the heavy silence that hung over every corner of the planet. The rebellion was gaining ground, but so were the forces against it. The Karen government had started retaliating, their once calm demeanor replaced with a fierce determination to squash any hope of change. Alira knew the stakes were high, but she couldn't help but feel that the walls were closing in around her. She had never been one to question the laws of her world. For so long, she had simply followed the rules, believing that to feel was to risk everything. But now, after everything that had happened, Alira could no longer ignore the truth that had been burning inside her. Her emotions weren't a threat, they were her strength. And as the resistance grew stronger, so did her resolve. Yet the consequences of defying the law became clearer with each passing day. The authorities had become ruthless. Public executions of those who broke the rules were becoming more frequent, their brutality a stark reminder of what was at stake. Alira's heart twisted in her chest as she thought of the people who had already lost everything for simply feeling something. The fear of punishment, the fear of losing those they loved, it was suffocating. And yet, despite it all, the human beside her had never wavered. His determination, his belief in the cause, was unwavering, and it gave Alira the courage to keep going. She met with him one evening in the quiet of their hideout, the dim light casting shadows on the walls as they sat together. The rebellion was reaching a breaking point, and Alira could sense it in the way everyone spoke, in the way they moved. There was an urgency now that hadn't been there before, a feeling that the final push was coming. But Alira was afraid of losing everything, of losing herself in the chaos of it all. "I'm scared," Alira confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy in her chest, but they were true. She had never allowed herself to voice her fear, but now, in the quiet safety of the human's presence, she couldn't hide it any longer. The human turned to her, his eyes filled with understanding. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough to convey what words couldn't. He reached out and placed a hand on hers, grounding her in the moment. "Fear is natural," he said softly, "but it doesn't have to control us. We fight because we believe in something greater than the fear. We fight because the world we know cannot stay the way it is, and you're stronger than you think, Illyra." His words were like a lifeline, pulling her from the darkness that threatened to engulf her. She had never seen herself as strong, not like the others who had fought alongside her, not like the human who led the charge. But now, in this moment, she understood. Strength wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing up in the face of fear and moving forward anyway. Illyra squeezed his hand, her heart beating a little faster as the weight of his words sank in. She had spent so many years living in the shadows of her own emotions, afraid to face what was inside her. But now, she knew that it was time to stop hiding. The world needed to see that they had a right to feel, to love, to hope, to dream. And she had a role to play in that. As the days passed and the rebellion continued to grow, Illyra found herself taking on more responsibility. She spoke to those who were still afraid, reminding them that they weren't alone. She saw the fear in their eyes, but she also saw the flicker of hope that had begun to burn within them. They weren't just fighting for freedom, they were fighting for their right to feel, to live without fear. And for the first time, Illyra felt truly alive. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer afraid to be herself. And with the human by her side, she was ready to fight for a world where no one would ever have to hide their emotions again. The final days of the rebellion were upon them, and Illyra could feel the weight of what they were fighting for heavier than ever. The city that had once felt so cold and unfeeling now seemed to pulse with the energy of change. Everywhere she went, she saw faces lit with the quiet fire of hope, a fire that had long been extinguished in the hearts of her people. But it wasn't just hope they had gained, it was freedom. The freedom to feel, to express, to be human, or in her case, to be Karen. The resistance had grown in strength, its numbers swelling with every passing day. People from all corners of the city, from every sector, came together, united by the same desire to reclaim their emotions. The law that had governed their lives for so long was finally being torn apart, and the foundations of a new world were slowly being built in its place. But Illyra knew it wouldn't be easy. The authorities were desperate to maintain control, and they would stop at nothing to crush the movement. Illyra stood by the window of their hideout, her gaze fixed on the skyline. The familiar sight of the city, its cold metal towers and lifeless streets, was no longer comforting. It felt like a prison, one she had lived in far too long. But now, she could see the cracks forming in its foundation. The rebellion had pushed the government to the edge. The time for change was near, and she knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. The human, now her partner in both the fight and in life, stood beside her, his presence grounding her. He had always been a steady force, his unwavering belief in their cause a constant source of strength for her. But even he couldn't hide the tension in the air. The government was making its move, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. "We're close," Illyra said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The human nodded, his eyes reflecting the same determination that had driven him from the start. "Closer than we've ever been," he agreed. "But we can't stop now, not when we're so close to winning." Illyra felt her heart beat faster at his words. They were so close, but she also felt the weight of the risks. The cost of victory was high, and she knew that some would not make it out alive. The fear of loss, of what they could lose in this final push, gnawed at her. But she refused to let it control her. They had come this far together, and she wasn't about to turn back now. As the final battle loomed, Illyra stepped into the streets one last time. The familiar faces of her people passed her by, their expressions no longer vacant but full of purpose. There was a fire in their eyes now, a fire that had been ignited by the courage of those who dared to stand up for what was right. She could feel it in the air. This was the moment of reckoning. The human joined her, and together, they walked through the city, leading the charge toward the government's stronghold. The streets, once silent and still, now thrummed with the sound of unity. The rebellion wasn't just a movement anymore. It was a revolution, one that would change everything. They weren't just fighting to overthrow a government. They were fighting for the right to be themselves, to live without fear, to feel freely. The battle was fierce, but in the end, the weight of the people's will proved stronger than the government's iron grip. The final blow was struck, and the laws that had once governed their emotions were no more. Illyra stood amidst the chaos, her heart pounding, her emotions flowing freely for the first time in her life. She could feel the victory in every inch of her being, and for the first time, she understood what it meant to truly live. The humans stood beside her, and their eyes met in a shared moment of triumph. They had done it. They had won. Together, they had changed the world. And as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden light on the city below, Illyra finally allowed herself to smile. She had fought for freedom, and now she had it. And in this new world, there was no longer any fear of feeling. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where emotions were no longer chains, but the very thing that made life worth living.